Hey, Mark, I have a question for you.
Sure. What's up, Paco?
Can something exist in the past, the present, and the future?
No, that sounds confusing. I think you have to pick one.
Okay, maybe. When did Socrates live?
I believe from around 470 to 390 BCE.
So, in the past.
Yeah.
But what if you were alive in, say, 380 BCE? Socrates would have been alive in the present.
Sure.
And if you had been alive in, say, 500 BCE, Socrates would have been alive in the future.
And?
So that means Socrates was alive in the past, the present, and the future. I thought you said something couldn't exist in the past, the present, and the future.
Well, it's relative to where you're at in time. It's relative to now.
But if all these events are just laid out in a series, Socrates' birth, Socrates' trial, Socrates' death, how do we know when now is?
I don't know. Maybe we'll find out on today's show.
That's right. Maybe we'll find out on today's show. Hey everyone, welcome to You've Got It All Wrong, a philosophy podcast for handsome people like you. I'm Paco Allen.
I'm Mark Sanders.
And I'm Chad Allen. So today we want to talk about philosophy of time, which is the topic of Paco and Mark's brief chit-chat.
Our impromptu, spontaneous.
Yes.
Just spontaneous.
You guys
chit-chat.
are such great
It just came to us.
improvisers.
We didn't have a show topic before we came in here to record today, and then I just that question popped into my head.
Yeah, and here you go.
Yeah.
So philosophy of time. So it's a big topic. We're going to try to carve off a little slice of it and talk about how time flows, or our experience of time flowing, and whether or not that's a real thing or perhaps just an illusion, and just kind of how the progression of time works in general.
And the main things we're going to be talking about, right, are A theory time and B theory time.
Yeah, right. So
who came up with this?
Oh, well, thanks for asking. Yeah, in contemporary philosophy, there's sort of like two schools of thought about how time works and lots of variations therein, and then a lot of people who don't believe either one of those, including the guy who kind of came up with the terminology, J.M.E. McTaggart, who wrote a paper in 1908 called The Unreality of Time, where he sort of outlined these two ways that time might work, the A series and the B series.
So he wrote that just before Einstein really kind of broke onto the scene with his big achievements.
Well,
right?
just after. I think it was written right after.
General was published in 1911.
Yeah, but he wrote it right after Special.
Oh, okay.
Which is weird because you would think that general relativity would have come before special relativity, but special relativity came first. So yeah, but I think he wrote it like 5 years after Einstein first started to put together his ideas of relativity, which obviously are related to time and will come into play in this conversation later.
I don't think McTaggart was following that, though.
No.
But that's cool. So like the invention of the light bulb happened simultaneously by people on different tracks, and they all happened at the same time. That time was just in the air.
I don't know. He was in Scotland. God only knows what he was doing.
Oh, the Scottish Enlightenment was very big for philosophers at that point.
So before we move on, a couple things about John McTaggart.
Yes.
J.M.E. McTaggart.
Yeah.
Lots of initials in there.
I feel like we should go back to having, like, I kind of want a name where it's just initials before my last name.
Like JCVD.
What's that?
Jean-Claude Van Damme.
Yes.
That's like that's how he's contemporarily known.
Or
Really?
the noted podcaster CGP Grey.
Right. Well, I've always wanted to kind of be C.G. Allen.
Didn't you write under that name at one point?
Yes, I did. And if you go to Amazon, you can find my Pulitzer Prize winning novel, which most people don't know it's me because it's written under C.G. Allen. It's called The Goldfinch. Maybe you've heard of it.
If you want a sweet name that's got lots of initials in them, you can do what John McTaggart did, which is put two names in twice. Because J.M.E. McTaggart stands for John McTaggart Ellis McTaggart.
Now, did he do that, or was that foisted upon him by his parents?
Sort of a little bit of both, I think.
So you know the story, John.
I know the story. So he was named after his uncle's surname was McTaggart, and so he was his middle name, his given middle name was McTaggart after his uncle, John McTaggart Ellis, right?
John McTaggart Ellis. Yeah,
John
the
McTaggart
came
Ellis.
from his uncle.
The McTaggart came from his uncle, but then in order to get his inheritance from his uncle, his family had to take his uncle's surname as their surname. Basically, in order to get his hands on his uncle's loot, the Ellis family had to tack on McTaggart as a surname.
So you just need to publish under Chad Allen Gordon Allen.
Right. And I'll be the heir to the Allen fortune.
Yeah. Yep. So last thing I want to say about John McTaggart, if you look him up and see the like classic portrait of him that's on Wikipedia and everywhere else.
And in show notes.
Yeah, it'll be in the show notes. Don't go to Wikipedia, go to the show notes first. Personally, he reminds me of Jonathan Quayle Higgins III.
Oh, yes.
Or Higgy Baby from Magnum P.I. But then also the fact that it's like shot in black and white in kind of like a really formal way makes it look like a presidential portrait. And he kind of looks like Truman and Roosevelt had a baby who then became the most powerful president of all time. Yeah. And well, then they based the character of Higgins on that president.
That super president.
The super president, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So be sure to check that out in the show notes.
Okay, so anyways, we should probably start talking about time here at some point. A series time? You want to walk us through that, Chad?
Sure. So A series time, I would say, kind of is the sort of how we maybe most naturally think and talk about time, which is this idea that there's a now and that everything's happening either now in the present or has happened in the past or will happen in the future. And we kind of move through time so that the present now becomes the past and the future becomes the present. And so there's sort of this like time is this thing that's actually moving forward along with us. And that's kind of how we talk about
like the
it.
present is constantly moving forward. There's
Right.
only one present. There's
Right.
only one now. And that the future like hasn't happened and the past has already happened.
Right.
For me, the only weird thing about the description of this, because again, like I think you said, it is kind of the intuitive model of time. It best describes time as we kind of generally experience it as people. But there's this weird idea about things moving from the future into the present.
Yeah.
Right. Which is like a weird way to describe it, especially if you think about things intuitively and don't believe in things like determinism, that the future has already been set, the idea that the future moves into the present.
Well, you could also say we move into the future.
Yeah. Anyways, like I do think that like you come across that type of description in A theory time, and it's the one part about the description of it that seems a little bit like counterintuitive.
It's also not perfect as well, and you see that in the metaphors we kind of try to hang on and map to time. So like take this, I don't know, thought experiment. There's a meeting at 2:00, and
I can't come.
the team you're meeting with can't make it at 2:00. They'd like to reschedule to 3:00.
Yeah.
Would you say you're moving that meeting up or back?
I'd say I'm moving it back.
But you're moving it back, but you're moving through time to a later date. You're moving forward, essentially.
Right.
You're moving that meeting forward in time.
This is what it's like to work with Mark.
So you're like, can we move that meeting back? And Mark's like, hold on a second.
Yeah. Are we moving it back or are we moving it up?
Oh, yeah, we're moving it forward in the direction of the arrow of time. The numbers 1, 2, 3, they're moving up.
And it gets work. If you want to move it more than an hour and it moves into a different week, then you got to have a conversation with Mark about, is it next week?
Right.
Or the week after next? Or next week, Thursday?
Right. Yeah.
Thursday week.
Thursday week?
Jeez, I'm so glad I don't work with you guys.
Anyways.
Well, so McTaggart.
McTaggart.
Who else does he remind you of? What was your favorite Magnum P.I. episode?
The crossover with Murder, She Wrote.
Oh, shit.
Really?
Yeah. Was Higgins actually
Robin Masters. Well, no, because in the finale, you see him without anyone around in the room on a phone for no reason, not having to pretend that he and him are two different people. He's on the phone talking to him. Like, why would he pretend to talk to someone if he is him?
You remember the finale of Magnum P.I. way better than I do.
All right, we'll put a link in the show notes to Netflix where you can watch it.
Yes.
Show notes.
Okay. So what else is unique or special about A theory time?
Well, you guys kind of touched on it in the opening. So let's not forget that McTaggart wrote this article about A series time and B series time because he was basically saying, here are the two ways that you can describe time, and both of them suck, and I can poke holes in both of them, and that's why the article was called The Unreality of Time. And so what he said about A series time was essentially what you were saying in the opening, Paco, which is that in A series time, you have to say that any given event has the property of being in the past, the property of being in the present, and the property of being in the future. And he says, like, that doesn't make any sense to say that one thing has all three of those properties because they're contradictory.
Right. So one of the main arguments that A-series backers will bring up to defend that version of time theory is the idea that no event has all those properties simultaneously.
Right.
Every event at one point will have the property of pastness, at another point presentness, and another point futurity. But as the A-series argument goes, those properties are mutually exclusive, and no point in time will ever have more than one of those properties simultaneously.
Right.
So events move from having futurity to having presentness to having pastness. But that leads us down a crazy path, because an event that will happen tomorrow, like the moment you wake up in the morning, is currently in the future, but at some point it will be in the present and then in the past. So you end up having to add this second layer of description. Those are called second order temporal properties. So right now, the event of waking up tomorrow has present futurity, meaning right now in the present, that event has the property of futurity.
Right.
And it also has future presentness. In the future, it will have the property of presentness. And it also has future pastness. And then if that wasn't confusing enough, when your alarm does go off tomorrow and you wake up, that event will have presentness, past futurity, and future pastness. So we just added third order temporal properties. And we can go on adding new layers, fourth, fifth, sixth temporal order properties, and so on. But we still have conflicting temporal properties, just a lot more of them. Add
right.
Another layer of describing.
It creates an infinite regression of contradictions, basically.
And you've also used a definition of time to describe time. So you have
I think that's the other way of saying
nested
it.
definitions of time.
So then there's B series time, right? Which McTaggart says is the other way of thinking about time, which is to think about time as just being laid out as a series of events, some of which are earlier than others or later than others. So you can think about it like a big movie reel, right? Where it's just like a series of frames. Some of those frames are earlier in the reel than others, and some are later in the reel than others. But there's no tense to that, right? There's no this thing is in the present and that thing is in the future. Just like one thing is earlier or later than another.
And our concept of now is purely an artifact, a side effect of the way we perceive the world around us.
And the analogy there is like, okay, to continue the film analogy, like now is whatever frame is being projected onto the screen at any given instant, right? And so you can think about sort of...
Our perception of now is some weird illusion or artifact of our consciousness.
Right. And so the reason that McTaggart didn't like this theory of time is that there's no really good explanation of what that projector light is an analogy to. If events are just laid out in a series of earlier and later events, then what's the magic thing that defines where we're at now in that series?
What is this? Where is the cosmic playhead that's moving through the tape?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this also causes other problems for a lot of people, which is like this version of time really leads you down a path of determinism. I mean, I think that that's a big hang up for a lot of people, is that the idea that all of these things exist simultaneously and that we're just experiencing them in a particular order, like really way more than A theory time puts you in a place where you have to start to contemplate determinism and the notion that the future is no different from the past or the present, and that it's all laid out and that we're just experiencing it. It brings that conundrum and that topic and that debate much more front and center with that theory of time than it is with A series time.
Yeah, for
or
sure.
A theory time. Okay. I think one of the things, we talked a little bit about the fact that Einstein's special theory of relativity was, that he kind of developed that and published that right around the same time that McTaggart was publishing his stuff on A theory and B theory time. And I think this is where physics and time philosophy start to merge pretty heavily, which is, I think for a long time, a lot of physicists favor B theory time because it works much better, or it works, period, with quantum mechanics and general theory of relativity and special theory of relativity in terms of describing how the universe works and describing time as a component, in the same way that light and mass are described in those theories.
Do we know if Einstein was aware of the A theory, B theory descriptions?
Well, I don't know if he was aware of them specifically, but he definitely made comments about time. I mean, clearly because it was part of his work, but he made comments about time that were much more, I think, in line with B theory time, where he basically described...
Yeah, I have a quote right here. He said, "Us physicists believe the separation between past, present, and future is only an illusion, although a convincing one."
There was an anecdote about a friend of his passed away, and he went to visit his widow, and he tried to console her by saying that her husband, his good friend, is alive at a point in the time continuum that they're just not experiencing right now. So she shouldn't be so sad that he isn't alive right now, because the fact that he is alive is something that exists, which it was recorded as the fact that it wasn't too consoling, but very accurate.
I bet. And so that's very like B series time type of view of the world. And it, because it's sort of, you can see why it appeals to scientists, because it kind of removes the dependence on, sort of like a human subjective experience of past, present, future.
There seems to be a thing in high-level physics and string theory and quantum physics where you often hear that it would be a lot easier if we just didn't have time. The equations would be a lot simpler. If we didn't have to restrict ourselves to just 3 dimensions, everything would be the math would be a lot easier to do, everyone.
Yeah,
I think part of it is that we experience time in a really specific way, and when you try to make time make sense with physics, which it's clearly related to because we've been able to measure and repeatedly produce the effects of time dilation, time behaves in a mind-boggling way when we actually start to measure it and look at it as a property of the universe. And so I think that people are still grappling with it and struggling with it to make it make sense with all of the physics that we've been able to test and measure, but also make sense with the way that we experience the world.
Well, and that's why there's this tendency, I think, among people who lean towards B theory, which is to say that our experience of time is just this like weird subjective artifact of human consciousness that it doesn't really map to any of our theories about how the world works or anything in physics. And I think that that's sort of borne out by the challenge that we have in sort of intuitively understanding time in the context of relativity. And so like, the idea that as you travel faster, time slows down is like...
But only to an external observer.
Right.
Like your time clock remains consistent within your
Sure. It doesn't seem to you like time is moving at a different rate.
Yeah.
But my point is that it is, and yet it doesn't appear that way to you. So
I mean, it's one of those things that like it's weird because we can produce that effect in repeatable scientific experiments. Like they send atomic clocks up with every astronaut to the ISS, and even the tiny fraction of a difference in the speed that they're traveling versus the rest of us the speed that the rest of us are traveling on the surface, when they come back down, their clocks have moved slower relative to our clocks, right? And that just, it doesn't even make sense, right? I can say those words and we can measure all that, and scientists say, yeah, that's how it works. But that sentence sounds like a paradox. It barely makes sense, and that's the smallest fraction of what you can do in terms of warping and bending and manipulating time, like on large scales.
Yeah, another example of that is the one I found. Is not just from an experimental point of view, but every GPS satellite that's swarming around the planet has a clock in it that needs to be in sync with the clocks that we use on our devices that can read the GPS data, and the clocks have to run slower on the satellites because they're going so fast and away from the planet.
But they're not even going that fast, like relative, in terms of relative, like if you want to talk about this getting close to the speed of light and the kinds of time dilation you'd see at that speed, it's hardly perceptible, the difference in speed that those satellites are going to us, and you still have to adjust their time to make sure that they sync up with the devices down here on Earth.
But it's not like if you were on one of those satellites, you would feel like time was slowing down.
Well, no, but even if one of those satellites was approaching the speed of light, you wouldn't feel like time was slowing down.
That's my point.
Yeah.
So it's like, to me, that sort of speaks to the fact that it's hard to square our subjective experience of time with the objective reality of time, right? Because we're saying that the time is slowing down on the satellites relative to time on the surface. But if you were on one of those satellites, your experience of time and how you flow or move through time would be exactly the same as it is if you were standing on the surface. So there, to me, that says there's some kind of weird disconnect between how time actually works and how we perceive it.
Yeah, I think so, for sure. I mean, I'll bring this up a little bit in the second half of the show, but I think in a lot of ways, physicists are starting to tackle the time component of like unified theory of everything after they've already tackled the other stuff that like gravity and mass and the speed of light and all those things. I kind of have a layman's view that it's the last big piece that's been tackled from a physics standpoint. And it's because it makes so little sense when you start to look at it at large scale, and I think that it's kind of being tackled in the same order that a lot of other aspects of unified theory have been tackled, where you start to look at things in like this in very small scale, in what you can directly sample, right? So like if an apple had actually fallen from a tree and hit Newton on the head, which that's an apocryphal story, but Newton starts to look at gravity from a really small, self-contained world of how does gravity work between me and this tree and this apple and the earth. And then you start to look at gravity, you start to observe the planets in our solar system and see how orbits work and think about gravity in that way. And then you look at solar systems and galaxies. But there comes a breaking point where your model for how gravity works in a relatively small, contained scale, like breaks when you get out to trying to understand how gravity works, looking at the universe.
Yeah.
And I think we're finding the same, physicists are starting to find the same thing with time and a lot of other aspects of unified theory, where things work at the math works at a certain scale and the model works at a certain scale. But anytime you try to like step out and understand it at a universal level, you kind of have to like rethink the paradigm of how all that stuff works.
And the same in the opposite direction when you look at the quantum level, that time starts behaving in a different way then as well.
Yeah. So
I just try to ignore that level usually.
Yeah, well, that's the American way, right? Like
right.
Bigger's better. Quantum's for losers.
Yeah, it's totally.
Okay, so
time isn't real. I think that we're gonna. Are we gonna agree with McTaggart.
Like in the same way that
you weren't stuttering there.
No.
in the same way that our fragile human brains, because we're born into this three-dimensional world, can't conceive perceptually of anything at a higher level of dimensions.
Well, there's that. Yeah, but also I think
the human eye can't see colors that the cones and the rods in the back of our retina aren't capable of processing.
Yeah, but I think McTaggart's argument is even deeper than that, which is that time is not actually a thing that exists. Like, there's no way to form a coherent definition of what time is. And so if you can't form a coherent definition of what it is, it's just like a word that we're using to like as a placeholder for something.
Yeah, I think maybe halfway through reading the research for this episode, I might have been somewhere close to agreeing with him, but I kind of now I feel like that's a little bit of an egotistical approach to it. Like, you know, McTaggart can't conceive of time based on what I understand.
Can you say that with a Scottish accent?
No, I mean it's been in the back of my head the whole time, but I think Mark's the closest to it.
Well, since I'm half Scottish.
Yeah, since you're half Scottish, half Australian, right?
I prefer the nickname M squared as well for McTaggart.
But I think the idea that there's these two theories of time that are over 100 years old that don't totally explain it, and therefore time doesn't actually exist, is like a pretty weak cop-out. And I think that it is like it's a required part of physics. Like,
can we get a famous physicist on the phone right now?
What are you like? Somebody going to do a bad Stephen Hawking impersonation? Is this a bit that we're going to do?
No,
or
okay, it's not a bit.
No. Then the answer is no.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah. Nope.
My whole thing is like, you know, for hundreds and thousands of years of human evolution, nobody was struggling with this idea, and everyone was quite happy to all agree on the same version of what time was. And suddenly, like, I think it can be something else. Was someone banging down his door because they were like struggling with it?
But you're just talking about all of philosophy now.
Yeah, and also, you know, like all of this stuff. There's conversations from the ancient Greek philosophers where they talk about
can never step in the same river twice.
Heraclitus.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the predecessor to this conversation.
That's a time theory conversation.
Ever since we had time to sit around and bullshit about stuff like this, people have been arguing about things like the nature of time.
So agriculture is the mother of philosophy?
Yeah, I think that's how I would say it.
Okay.
It's the mother of all bullshitting, including philosophy. Yeah.
It's the mother of all problems. Did you guys come across C theory time?
I saw that on the Wikipedia
saw it,
page.
and then I was like, that's one too many.
Oh, I've 7 paragraphs deep in this Wikipedia article. I can't do the last one. It's the last paragraph before the notations.
I got stuck on the McTaggart rabbit hole. I was tracking down that.
I read it.
Who does this guy remind me of?
I read it as like A theory, sure, we all agree on that. B theory, a new radical, useful theory. C, marketing term. Someone just wanted to get on some of that time theory.
Yeah, it is like an offshoot of
so tell us about
like,
C theory.
It's like B.2.
It's someone saying like, oh, we're Web 3.0. That doesn't mean anything.
Well, but okay, tell us about C series.
Well, it's not that interesting, and now Mark's made it. It's not. Now I'm going to sound like that guy. Now I'm the marketing guy. Hey, have you guys heard of C theory time? So
when you travel on ocean liners, that's C theory time.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, look. Yeah. Yep.
Perfect use of the bell, by the way.
The bell indicates the worst joke of the evening, which we know is not going to happen in the future because that was the worst joke that could have been done. So C theory time, from my understanding, is really similar to B theory time, and that all moments exist simultaneously, but they aren't moving in one direction. Like even B theory time, things exist in the past relative to other things and exist in the future relative to other things. It's tenseless.
And they only exist once in each of those times.
But in C theory time, all of those moments exist simultaneously, but there isn't even a direction that they are experienced in, and one of them doesn't exist before the other one. It's like if you imagine the alphabet as a timeline, but A isn't the first letter and Z isn't the last letter. They just exist in that order, and they could and you could go sobriety style, Z to A or A to Z. One of those isn't the future. One of those isn't the past. That's
one's
just,
not earlier or later than the other.
It's the order that they exist in, but they don't have a starting point and an end point, or an end point and a starting point. It's just like it could go LMNOP or PO. Yeah, this is why that sobriety test is bullshit. Can't do it when you're sober.
Are you sober?
Well, no, but that's not the point.
In Big Bang Theory, you can calculate the fact that the center of the universe is at every point of the universe.
They're all moving away. All points are moving away from each other.
And all points were in the center at one point. So this table that we're looking at is also in the center of the universe.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we're sitting around it. I thought this was the center.
This is maybe a center.
Oh. There can be more than one center?
I think technically there's a town in Kansas who's declared themselves to be the center of the universe.
Really?
And that's like their claim to fame. For the same way that everywhere could be acclaimed that they are also the center of the universe, that they were the first to do it. Also, there's a place in Kansas that is actually the center of the United States as well, so maybe that's where they got the idea from.
Really?
That sounds more like the origin of it.
Yeah.
Oh, you're the center of the United States? We're the center of the universe.
Okay, so is C theory of time a contender, or it sounds to me like it has the same problem, which is that it sounds like it is even worse. Like there's no way for me to sort out like what the now is in C series time. And so
not what the now is, but why
this
now.
particular letter in the alphabet is now.
Yeah, why am I experiencing N instead of M?
Right. Yeah. So I don't know.
I just brought it up because it was another letter. I got a theory.
Have you heard about D series time?
No, tell me about that.
I don't know. I'm going to write that. I feel like C series time is also like the kind of like bullshit that philosophers pull when they're like, I know how I'm going to get published. C series time.
Well, so last thing, unless you guys have anything else before we go to the break, but I think one of the things that was interesting about B series time, one, it seems to jive with models within physics and how the universe works. But I think one of the things that helped kind of describe that to me and how the model of B theory time could work is describing it as block time.
Oh yeah, that's the growing block or whatever, right?
Well, so this is the super confusing thing when you get into this. No, there's growing block.
It's a theory that says everything in the past and everything present is real.
Yeah, everything in the past still exists. Time is like a growing block,
right?
That starts in the past, and every instant of time that occurs adds to the block. So it's a growing block. So the past exists.
And the present
exists. It's kind of like somewhere in between A and B.
Right.
I think it's technically a subset of B theory time because the past still exists in some way.
Right.
But block time basically says that that time should be treated like all other fundamental components of existence in the universe, like space and mass and light.
Yeah.
And that it exists. The reason they call it block time is because it exists like in all directions simultaneously.
Past, present, and future.
Yeah. And that, it's as much a kind of three-dimensional component of the universe as space or matter.
Should we in that case be
confused?
Should we be looking for a time particle?
Yeah, fuck yeah. I mean,
that's a great way to get published.
Yeah.
And let's build a Large Hadron Collider for the time particle.
I think it's the plot of the third G.I. Joe movie.
G.I. Joe time particle?
Search for Curly's time particle.
All right. I think that's enough for now. Mid-show break.
Yes,
Yes.
let's do it.
Hey everyone, it's Mark. We just wanted to take a few seconds and thank everyone for listening. And if you're enjoying the show so far, there's something we'd like to ask you to do to help us out. Head over to iTunes and give us a review. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to the show. Ratings, reviews, and subscriptions are the main factors that determine whether we get noticed and the podcast becomes a weekly fixture in your ears. We'd really appreciate the support. Now back to the show.
Okay, so in the second half of the show, we like to talk about interesting trivia and facts that we learned during our research for the show. And we talked a little bit about relativity earlier. And when I was kind of reading up on that, I read about this interesting experiment. There have been lots of experiments to demonstrate the accuracy of the special and general theories of relativity. What I think counts as the cheapest experiment ever to demonstrate the effects of relativity was conducted in 1971 by Joseph Halfley and Richard Keating.
And this is like the effects of relativity on time.
Sorry,
specifically?
yeah,
Right,
on time
right.
specifically. And so, what they did was they bought plane tickets on commercial airliners in the name of Mr. Clock, and then they put an atomic clock on those commercial planes, and they were like, I don't know, long intercontinental flights.
Mr. Clock sounds like one of the alien characters from Dark City. Mr. Clock, it's time to tune.
All right, so they flew.
Which is also like a Sweet Time movie.
So they flew the plane. They just put it on these commercial airliners and let it sit there over the course of multiple flights. So they put it on flights traveling east.
Where did they put it?
In a fucking seat, like on the plane.
It's Mr. Clock.
They bought a seat. This is what I love about the experiment. It cost $8,000 to run this experiment.
Okay, but they told people they were doing this, right?
Yeah, there's actually
like they had consent from the airline.
There's
So they
actually
didn't make the
like
clock
this wasn't
like
like
arms and
so
legs.
pre 9/11 that you could like buy a seat on an airplane and just put a suitcase in it and be like,
See ya.
no.
Because the way you were telling it was like, the way you were telling it was like, it kind of sounded like they were doing this covertly, like nobody knew about it. And they're just like, yeah, I'm going to buy a seat under the name Mr. Clock.
Hey, do you hear something ticking from that seat next door with no one sitting in it?
Yeah, it's an atomic clock. TikTok.
Hey, Leslie, who's got seat JB? It's Mr. Clock. Oh, well, that makes sense for the ticking.
Are these planes run out of like the Bronx? Or
Yeah,
what?
yeah. And back then, all the flight attendants were Bronx mafioso.
Right. So there's actually interesting sort of like PR photos, or I guess press photos from these experiments where
PR stands for press release. So
thank you.
They could be press photos.
where there are photos of stewardesses standing in the aisle, like next to the atomic clock, checking their watches,
Getting slowly irradiated.
Serving it drinks.
So anyway, I just thought it was interesting that they ran this experiment in this totally like lo-fi way, like using commercial airliners and portable atomic clocks. And sure enough, the clocks end up being out of sync with the clocks that they had on the ground at the Naval Observatory.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy how
For $8,000, you can in $1971, you can
it's
prove
crazy
special relativity.
how precise the like measuring instruments we had, even back in the 60s and 70s are, and like how precise our understanding of math was, that we were able to do things that like NASA existed and did all the things that it did, and that you can, I mean, like the speed of a commercial airline and the amount of time dilation that happens on a commercial airline versus what's happening on the surface of the Earth is so minuscule. Like I don't remember what it was, but I mean, like I said, earlier in the show, they do this on the International Space Station all the time, where they send atomic clocks up with people. And somebody might stay up there for 6 months or whatever, how long was the longest commercial flight,
Yeah. But it's like billionths of a second. I mean, to
oh
your point,
yeah,
like
that's
that,
what I'm.
the
That's what I
accuracy of the
mean. That's what I
clocks
mean.
insane.
Is that even when you're sending somebody up to the International Space Station, and that thing's traveling way faster than a commercial plane relative to the surface of the Earth, and that somebody's up there for 6 months, even when they come back, it's the amount of time difference, the amount that their clocks have slowed down is so minuscule that it is hard to believe that in the 70s they were doing this on a commercial airline and were able to measure a difference.
And now, so I guess it's important to note that it's not just that they were able to measure a difference, but they were able to measure the difference predicted by relativity, by the theory of relativity. So it's like confirming not just of the general phenomenon, but confirming of the theory specifically.
Yeah, the fact that all that was worked out by a patent clerk in his spare time with pencil and paper before World War One is crazy. Yeah.
So Leonardo DiCaprio will star in that movie, right?
Yes,
okay.
I can't wait.
Catch Me If You Can, relativity style, where he's running around the world with as an airline pilot carrying an atomic clock. I have one other crossover. The other star in Leonardo DiCaprio's Steven Spielberg classic Catch Me If You Can was Tom Hanks, who played the part in A Castaway of a person whose job was to send clocks on planes that were supposedly delivering FedEx packages to understand how long it took to get a package from A to B. He would wrap up a clock and send it and open the clock at the other end and say, hey.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it only took you 27 hours
that
to
was
get
part of his character's backstory?
That's how he was wrecked on the island. He was in one of those planes.
Yeah, I remember that he worked for UPS or whoever sponsored that movie.
It was the idea that they were somewhat being reckless, that in the interest of the fast modern paced life, is that he learned the value of taking things slowly and calmly away from civilization.
Man, all of that was lost on me. Also, the idea that he was sending those clocks in these planes to time out how long it took.
Why didn't he just start a stopwatch on his
or
phone?
Work out when they left and work out when they arrived.
Yeah.
Well, I think he was doing kind of a door-to-door test.
Oh, I was going to say...
If I dropped off in a store, the operating costs of the store clerk in the UPS store, processing it and putting it on the truck, and then the internal systems, and then at the other end, getting it down to the door-to-door service. I think he was trying to time a lot of different things.
Yeah, it just seems like if that was part of the setup of that movie, that time could have played a lot cooler and bigger part of that movie than...
Are we talking about Castaway? Can we talk about something else?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We can talk about another movie.
What else can we talk about?
Well, we can transition from that movie into another movie, which is a movie that I would like to recommend. I mean, so most of the interesting stuff that I came across that's relevant to the philosophical debate or discussion, we already talked about. I'll bring up one other thing, but a lot of the other stuff. Was cool movies that are based on time.
Yeah. All right. Well, you know that movies are not allowed.
Well, it's not Star Trek, and it's not The Matrix, or The Animatrix, or any other Matrix based.
I just think that we should be able to illustrate these topics without...
Yeah, I'm not going to illustrate any topics. It's just a time-related movie that's cool.
You just want to talk about movies.
I just want to recommend...
You just want this to be our movie podcast.
Yeah, this is the movie section of the podcast.
Well, I think what it would be great if you
could... Where I recommend a movie.
If you could illustrate if any of these movies represent A or B theory time.
Yeah, no movie kind of represents that because they break all time rules.
Okay, what fucking movie do you want to recommend? Is it Mad Max Fury Road?
Well, I would recommend Mad Max Fury Road as well, but it has nothing to do with time. I'd recommend a Spanish movie called Time Crimes.
Time Crimes?
Time Crimes, which is, I believe that movie was made because the phrase time, crime, and the fact that it rhymed popped into somebody's head, and they were like, well, now I got to make something based on time crimes. It is Spanish.
But with an an English title?
Well, when you see it in English, it's
Crimes de Tiempo.
Wait, but it doesn't rhyme.
Yeah, well, no, this is like any other thing where somebody translates a song and it happens.
Have you seen this movie?
Oh yeah, no, it's great.
Can I ask?
In Spanish, it's called Cronocrímenes.
Oh, it sounds
which is pretty sweet
better,
too. Yeah.
Now, was this made before or after Time Cop?
So you're bringing back JCVD into this?
Yeah,
that's a good callback. I think
crossover
after because I believe Time Cop took place or was made. I I don't know, late 90s. This is 2007.
Okay, definitely.
After Time Cop. So anyways, time related podcast. It's a cool time travel movie. That's all based on time.
Into the
What is
theme
what's,
or argument
what's the
at all?
concept?
Yeah,
we can do
It
it.
just has time in the
Was,
title.
it's about time.
Was Tom Hanks in it?
No, Tom Hanks wasn't in it.
That could have tied it in.
It's super low budge. I'm bringing it up because probably nobody's seen it, because it's I'm not saying like, hey, we did a podcast on time, you should see this cool time travel movie called The Terminator or Back to the Future. No, it's like a super low budge Spanish time travel movie, and if you're interested in the idea of time, it's a cool short little 90-minute low budge flick about time loops, where a character kind of like stumbles into this. There's a crime that happens, and then there's some time travel, and then there's this like constant feedback loop on itself.
Is there a dubbed version? Because I hate reading subtitles.
No, there isn't a dubbed version. I mean, it might as well be dubbed, because like it feels like the whole thing was done. All the audio was done with ADR, because it, like even the Spanish language version.
Did you do any research and find anything interesting, or you just watched this movie?
I watched this movie. It was really, I mean, yeah, I watched it a while ago. It was really sweet. Everybody should watch it.
How would you say that the mechanics of time differ from, say, Primer or Looper? Both time loop
so
movies.
I would say that, look,
on Primer.
Chad's big on Primer, and I would say, like, if you like a movie like Primer, you should watch Time Crimes.
See show notes for our affiliate link.
I'm pretty sure it's free on Amazon Prime right now.
What? Primer?
Time Crimes.
No.
No, fuck Primer.
Amazon Prime.
So much better than Primer. All right. Okay. So that was my one movie-related thing that I get to say for the rest of the history of this podcast.
It's fine if you're not trying to illustrate a philosophical concept with a movie. Then
no, I wasn't.
Okay,
it was a
I
podcast about time, and it's a sweet time movie.
I would like. Did you have any more?
Oh yeah, I do.
Oh,
Yeah,
go ahead.
This is much more intellectual. Okay, so like in looking at different time theory and philosophy on time, both the A and the B, and let's just throw out C because it's like not a lot of people talk about it and nobody else read about it. But weirdly, those are still like the two. There's subsets of those that have evolved and come up and been developed since McTaggart first wrote about them, but they're still the two primary forms of time philosophy that people still talk about today. But I came across this guy named Lee Smolin, who's a PhD and a physicist, but he's had some major contributions to string theory and quantum mechanics, and trying to make sense of bringing quantum mechanics and relativity together, which has kind of been an ongoing problem for physicists. But he's also, along the way, gotten pulled down into this conversation about time and how time works. And he's written a lot of books. The big one that he has that's based almost completely on time is called A New Theory on Time, which kind of crosses over between the philosophy of time and physics. And obviously I just came across this in the last couple of days as we were working on this episode, so I haven't read it, but I've watched a couple of his lectures and presentations. And I think anybody who's interested in this and wants to kind of get a modern take on how time works with some really cutting edge ideas on physics and the philosophy of time works, he's kind of seen as a rabble-rouser in the world of physics, because he feels like things like string theory and quantum mechanics and relativity are kind of taken as fundamental assumptions now, and that nobody's doing any real interesting work to try to move those things forward or challenge any of the ideas. It's just kind of like, oh, there's some major problems in these things and how they don't work together, so let's try to tinker with some little pieces of it. Right. And he feels like there's some larger, more fundamental things that need to be rethought. The big one being, he considers himself a believer of naturalism, which it's the idea that like all things can be described by what exists in the natural physical world, that all things exist and are based on the laws of physics, that there is no other layer of things, right? So like when we talk about like
physicalism
and consciousness and those things, that like our consciousness doesn't exist somewhere else other than in the physical world. And there's one form of naturalism which he calls type 1 naturalism, which is everything exists according to a set of fixed laws. The universe operates according to a set laws of physics and mathematics. But then there's another type of naturalism, which is kind of what he believes in, which says that everything is described and works and behaves according to set laws of physics, but that those things change and evolve the laws themselves change and evolve in the same way that like organisms change and evolve over time, and that the idea of a bacteria or a virus or any other living organism evolving over time.
So like as the universe expands, the laws of physics change.
He says that he thinks that they change, and that they change for different reasons and at different rates, and that some of them can change. Like we see like huge changes in evolution over really short periods of time. We see giant spikes and we see long periods of slow evolution. And he believes that the laws of physics change and evolve in the same way. And that also you have the same scale thing that we talked about earlier, where it's like, I'm going to build my theory of gravity based on what I can observe on this planet. But then when I try to apply those to galaxies interacting, it doesn't work. And I've got to like rework that theory, that those laws change on those types of scales as well. So he very much believes that there is a naturalist equation for how time works that also works with the way that we experience it. He basically believes that there's a version of A theory time in a way that works the way that we experience it, but that also works with like a universal unified theory of physics.
That would be great. I think that's the best outcome for this dilemma, because it always makes me uncomfortable when our theories in physics are impossible to say out loud in English without contradiction.
Right. Or when there are philosophical arguments that make complete logical sense, but also intuitively feel wrong, right? Like determinism is one of those that I'm sure when we do that episode, we'll get deep into. But determinism is one of those things that personally, when I hear the argument for it from a philosophical standpoint, it's hard for me to argue against it. But it feels incredibly counterintuitive because we feel like we have agency. And that's another thing that he thinks is fundamentally broken about B theory types of time philosophy, and that where he's headed with his combination of philosophy of time and physics,
all right,
he believes
we should do a whole episode on this guy.
Technically, we already have done one in the future.
Yeah, I mean,
All right.
Well, no, not according to him, but because he also, it's also really interesting because then he looks at the effects of your approach to time theory on politics and civics and social structure, and he feels like B theory time and things like determinism are not just wrong in terms of their description of the universe and how time works, but obviously incredibly destructive. If you got everybody on the planet to believe in determinism and it wasn't true, it'd be really bad for us because everybody would just be like, well, future's already done. Doesn't matter what I do. Like, I'm going to phone in the rest of my life, right?
It's the Catholic model where hasn't God already decided whether I'm saved or I'm not?
So, I mean, he talks about like environmental catastrophe and kind of where we are in history and the fact that like we need to make some major decisions as a species about how we're going to move forward.
Yeah.
And if you believe in determinism, like that can go really badly. But if you believe that you have agency in the world and you can make change and you can impact the future.
This is like the trailer for our episode on free will and determinism.
In a world.
I can't wait for that episode. As you know, I have some very specific viewpoints on that topic.
In a world where Lee Smolin has free will.
What's his name? Lee
Smolin.
Can we get him as a guest star?
Man,
you don't think we're good enough for you?
I'm in
the
a right.
second time you've called for a guest on this show.
While you were talking. Paco, do you think someone else
Yeah,
can talk
could
right
Lee-
now?
If you weren't there and Lee Smolin was, could we make that happen? All right. So, Time Crimes and Lee Smolin.
Okay, great.
I have very limited list. I saw a great plaque while researching this topic on Wikipedia.
You saw the plaque on Wikipedia, or you saw it while you were researching on Wikipedia?
While I was researching Wikipedia, there was a picture of a building with a plaque that commemorated a birth of a famous person, John L. Flugelhorn, the inventor of time travel, who was born in 1849 and died in 1909. And
Wait, we invented time travel?
Well, that's the thing. We did in the future, or we did in the past. So one of the proofs of time travel is, shouldn't there be time travelers amongst us already?
Yeah.
So I think that has some particular applications. I don't know really what the answer to that is. Like, if there aren't any time travelers, does that mean time travel is not possible at all? Or are there more rules about it that you can't go back? Maybe you can only go forward.
Are you asking me what the rules of time travel are?
Yeah, I'm just... It's like the Drake equation.
Or are you looking for proof? Like, I mean, one potential proof is that John Hillerman, the actor who played Higgins, potentially also wrote about.
Was McTaggart.
Yeah, it was McTaggart.
throughout history.
Wait, what was the plaque?
This plaque. It was a gag. It was this time travel that lived in this one house. And it was commemorating his great achievements of inventing time travel. He was born in 1849, died in 1909. He lived in the building in 2063.
Right.
So
it was a.
Yeah, I mean, so go to Amazon Prime, watch Time Crimes. I mean, I'm getting shit for my recommendations, and then Mark comes in here with a joke plaque from Wikipedia.
My other piece of trivia is because that just came to me and I just find it amusing. Maybe McTaggart could have popularized this theory more if he'd had help from TC and Rick to actually publish this wider.
No, I think he would have been more successful if TC and Rick and Magnum weren't causing so much trouble for him
on the big island.
Yeah,
he could have just sat there and written his philosophical treatise.
Yes.
Yeah.
Instead of pretending to be Robin Masters.
Yeah, but instead Magnum's, stealing the Ferrari and
yeah. Oh yeah, it was very disruptive to his philosophical work, for sure.
So on the theory of people who possibly are or aren't time travelers, I came across this great anecdote that a previously untouched village in the deepest jungles of South America, where missionaries or explorers arrived to greet them for the first time, and they were trying to learn their language in an explorative way. And as they were learning their language, they were talking with the tribe elders. And every time the elder would talk about an event in the future, he would wave his hand behind his head. That event, and every time he talked about
confusing,
and every time he talked about a future an event in the past, he would point his hand out in front of him.
Right. He's like, do you want to move this meeting forward or backward?
yeah.
But it turned out
can we do this at work? Where it's like, which way do you want to move the meeting, Mark? Like, and then I'll wave my hand behind me or wave my hand in front of me.
Because the initial speculation that was in some sociological magazines was like, wow, we've found a tribe that perceives time differently, that maybe if all of the notions of what our sense of now is a factor of either a culture or our nurture.
It was such a terrible time in sociology when we thought that we could infer those things from language. But yeah.
But it turned out in the end, the metaphor that this particular tribe had with time wasn't any different from ours. And the reason why they were talking about the future as waving behind the head is that's the things they can't see because it's in the future and hasn't happened.
Yeah,
and the things that are in the past are in front of them, hence waving forwards. Like, I can see those things that happened.
I've heard this story before, like applied to Native American tribes. So like I wonder if that anecdote is historically accurate or potentially just
reflected
more,
in multiple cultures as like just a practical implication of being able to represent something that's abstract.
I mean, it makes sense, right? Like one thing you can't see and have no knowledge of, and it's behind you, and one thing you've already experienced and you can see it and you know it.
Agreed.
I heard a great podcast on Groundhog Day where they kept looping the entire episode and they got to different points and they'd start again within the context of the podcast.
Let's not do that. I think that instead of starting this podcast over right now, we should end it.
Good move.
Agreed. Okay. Well, that's it.
That's all. That's
see,
it.
See you next time.
That's all the time we have.
Okay. Terrible jokes end now. That wraps it up for this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and give us a rating in iTunes. As always, you can find us online at you'vegotitallwrong.net, where you can find show notes for today's episode. You can also send us an email to feedback@you'vegotitallwrong.net with questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics. And you can also follow us on Twitter. I'm at Paco Allen.
I'm at Chad Allen.
And I'm at M. Saunders.
Oh wait, I don't even need to put the music in. Excellent. Okay. Intro music.